Welcome, and thank you so much for attending.
Excuse me, can you bring back the first slide? First one. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Sure. So just some housekeeping.
Es muy italiano. Fuimos a un instituto.
We have a lot.
Wait. Just a minute. Hold on.
Fernanda, we can't hear you. You've been muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry about that. Oh, wow. This is okay. We'll try again. Welcome and thank you so much for attending. Some housekeeping. We have a lot of people on the call this evening, so please type your questions in the chat and Barbara will answer them after the talk. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel at some point. If you would like to purchase a pre-signed copy of Barbara Mensch's book, In the Shadow of Genius, The Brooklyn Bridge and Its Creators, please contact Nancy Hunt at Barnes & Noble, 732-867-0276, or am660@bncollege.com. And I put that information in the chat, and it's also on the press release. You can order the book from Barnes & Noble, but if you want the pre-signed copy, you need to contact Nancy. A bit about the Bishop Lecture. The Bishop Lecture was named in memory of the son of Louis Faugères Bishop Jr., a prominent cardiologist and book lover who helped build one of the excellent New York private libraries at the New York Racket Club. Dr. Bishop had close family ties to Rutgers and New Brunswick. For example, Bishop House and Bishop Place on the College Avenue campus were named after him, even though he himself was an alumnus of Yale. Dr. Bishop was able to attend the first Bishop Lecture in 1985, but sadly died the following year. These lectures feature diverse topics on book arts, book and manuscript collecting, printing history, the use of rare books and manuscripts, and many other topics. A few examples include talks on Black bibliophiles, Japanese printing, the discovery of the Huckleberry Finn manuscript,
Interesting.
the recovery of the confiscated Yidalus autograph collection from Europe, and gallery owner Martin Diamond on collecting early 20th century abstract artists. More recent Bishop lectures include David Greenberg, Rutgers Professor of History, Journalism, and Media Studies, on Who Spoke Up, Liberals, the Left, and the Great Debate Over Entering World War II. Virginia Dilks on Remembering World War I through the eyes of a World War I combat engineer, Charles Edward Dilks. And last year, Professor Gail Levin from Baruch College on Stolen Art and History, a curator uncovers theft from the Edward Hopper estate.
Wow. Wow. So fascinating.
So Barbara Mensch is a fine art photographer and author who probes her subject matter with the curiosity and stamina of a detective. Her widely regarded images have been shown in galleries and published worldwide and have been the subject of numerous articles, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Observer, and Time Out New York. Ms. Mensch has published two important books about the New York waterfront, South Street, 2007, and The Last Waterfront, 1985, about New York's legendary Fulton Market, which she photographed under the scrutinizing eyes of both federal law enforcement and the organized crime community. Barbara Mensch has lived alongside the Brooklyn Bridge for over 30 years. She has photographed it at all times of day, all seasons of the year, from both inside and out. After years of living with the bridge, Barbara became fascinated by the people who designed and built it. Please welcome Barbara Mensch to speak on In the Shadow of Genius, the Brooklyn Bridge and its Creators.
I'm so used to hearing a couple little hand claps. So thank you so much, Fernanda. And it's a great honor to have you tap me to do this talk albeit it's on Zoom, so I'll do the best job I can to pretend that I'm talking to you in person, which would have been my preference. What we're looking at on the screen, I thought I would open up with this wonderful shot of John Roebling, Mr. Roebling, the great immigrant from Mühlhausen, some of the wonderful selection of drawings and notebooks that you have at your archive that literally and figuratively transformed my life. And in this abbreviated talk, I'd like to wind my personal journey with that and my personal story with that of the three amazing principal creators of the Brooklyn Bridge that I discovered through my own challenged, challenged efforts to photograph this structure, one of the most photographed structures in the world, one of the most photographed icons in the world. So the challenge to do something different or to allow myself to go to take my curiosity where it would possibly end up was a life-changing experience. So to start this lecture, we can, or this talk, perhaps Fernanda could advance the screen to the first image, which is not mine. But I have to say that every artist, every musician, every writer, every human being has influences from somewhere, whether they're conscious of it or not. And perhaps if some of my former students from the ICP are listening, they'll know, oh, she's getting into her painting talk again. So one thing that became very apparent to me as I started photographing the bridge outside my window was I thought about how many artists over time focused on a repetitive theme or one singular subject, and from that one single exploration, they would try to find some universal truth. So for me, I chose three artists who I felt not only influenced my thinking, but also best represented a little bit of what this journey I was about to take would become. So the first image we're looking at is Claude Monet and his obsession with haystacks. And one of the things that he did in his painting was he wanted to express light and the change of time during the day and see how that transformed an object. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, next. Okay, see, so here he was again at a different time, and you could see if you focus in the background, you could see the houses in the back. So, you could see his visual thinking that, at once he was staring at this one object and yet interpreting it differently, trying to dissect what seems to be a sunset or maybe a sunrise. It's hard for me to tell, but basically you already see the difference in the mood and emotional reaction that we have to his paintings. Okay, you can advance it. Okay, and in this one, which is clearly winter light, you can see that Monet moved his easel a little bit, and lo and behold, he had two haystacks instead of one. So even though it seems very simplistic, it changes the whole narrative of his experience of seeing. And of course, with this light, this cool blue light and the orange coming from the sky, he's showing you how his love for that subject matter and how it was almost indefinite that he could continue painting that same scene in infinitum. So let's go to the next image. Okay, and here's another one of my heroes, Paul Cezanne, and I chose to show a couple of his paintings of Mount Saint-Victoire in the south of France. I don't know exactly how many paintings he did of this one mountain. I remember seeing a show at the Philadelphia Museum, and there were probably about 10 on one wall. So we can only imagine that he had numerous sketches and perhaps watercolors. So and of course, he was known as the father of modern art, for reasons that we can't go into in this lecture, but basically you can see his play with perspective and geometric forms and tonalities that are closely knitted together. So we can go on to the next slide. And here's another one of Cezanne's paintings of Mount Saint Victoire, seen in the background with the valley set against it and this tree that leads you right into the picture. So you could see just from these two examples that his fixation on this mountain went far beyond his love of it, because he was actually using this form to continually explore a new language in visual art, which was breaking up spaces. So let's go to the next one. One and another love of mine are the Japanese printmakers, and there are two that I continually confuse: Hiroshige and Hokusai. So these are images that Hiroshige did of Mount Fuji, and here you see him portraying the mountain with a very, very, very strong form and line. You see almost the triangle of the mountain against the sky with the clouds. It's just absolutely brilliant. And then on the bottom, you see a little bit of the landscape of the smaller trees. We can go to the next one, and I hope I'm not racing through this, but
Oh, no, you're fine.
And so again, here's another example of Hiroshige's Mount Fuji, which I think is just utterly fantastic. And again, you could see with all of these artists that I picked out, the fascination with this one single subject matter. So what we're going to do now is get into my own personal journey. So I'm going to show you some of my contact sheets and some photographs that perhaps other people have seen before, but we can advance to my slide. Okay, so this is, I chose this one because it kind of captivates my influence of some of the painters that we just looked at, and how the New York Tower, which has probably been photographed, we can't, how many photographs have been taken of the Brooklyn Bridge Towers? It's impossible to know. But for me, and of course, I'm not showing these in any chronological order, but it was clear after my trip to Mühlhausen and experiencing in Germany, in particular, the whole Gothic influence, that the towers, for me, living literally 10 minutes from my door from the New York Towers, had resonated not only my own spiritual relationship with the structure, but also what I had learned about Mr. Roebling's early influences in Germany vis-a-vis his notebooks. So I believe that the image that I used, that I printed, I think this is a little large, this screen. It's okay, it doesn't matter. Was most likely one on the bottom left or the upper right. But at any rate, you get to see the play of light coming through the towers. And to me, that represented almost in the essence of John Roebling, the spiritual and the material coming together. But we'll get into that a little later. So let's go on to the next. Okay, and here is another. You may want to move the cursor away a little bit if you can. Is that me or you?
I moved it away.
Oh, so sorry, mi dispiace. So here is another image of the bridge I took years ago from my roof. It was on one of these holidays. They always, New York, they always light up the Brooklyn Bridge for all kinds of occasions. And one of the beauties of being a photographer is you amass all these pictures, these negatives, and then you forget, because this is I still I still have a lot of defenses against digital photography, but just trying to imagine that if you've been photographing for 20, 30 years, how many pictures, how many pieces of film, how many rolls of film. So the beauty of this project and others that I've worked on was to go back in time and see what you had. So I found this one. It was actually a color print that I converted, and I named it The Foreboding Towers. I have no idea, but basically the idea of showing this is to show you that from my rooftop, I used to shoot all kinds of pictures of the bridge. It was one of my favorite spots to stand. Okay, we can advance. Okay, and this one is very special. This contact sheet is from outside my window. And one of the most wonderful experiences of living next to the Brooklyn Bridge and the East River is to have the experience of fog. And particularly with those majestic towers and the span right outside my window, um, it came to pass that sometime in November, actually around this time, and into early December, we would get the heaviest fog over the bridge because the seasons were changing. So you'd have the difference between the colder weather and the warmer waters coming together. And when I was looking at this slide and choosing it for the talk, I said, you know what? I tried to imagine what it was like in the 1800s when the men were working on constructing the bridge, and what it was like to know that this tower that they were constructing was going to be, with the exception of Trinity Church, the highest thing in New York. And that when you climbed, as you climbed up, for example, when they were creating the tower, that you couldn't see a thing. So some of these shared experiences, by looking at the bridge, they become timeless, and you can almost go back in time with them and imagine what it was like to be in New York at that particular time period. So, and you could see from the contact sheet, if you look, the ebb and flow of the light over the towers was just mesmerizing. And anytime I'd wake up in the morning and see that fog, I get so excited. I mean, it was just like, these special events that happened in your life where you could see the world literally disappear. So these early, and so I'm showing you these because these were my early journey into being mesmerized with the structure, but not yet understanding what was about to happen to me. So we can continue on with the next one. I forgot which one it is. This one. Yes. So this is an early shot I took down by the waterfront, which is literally 2 blocks from my door in my warehouse building. And this picture, like so many others I made, evokes the loneliness of the waterfront. And because back in the early 80s, it certainly was abandoned. There was a homeless community, but also there's a certain kind of melancholy knowing that this great superstructure was located in a part of town that no one ever came to. And as a result, which is a discussion we can't have tonight, but how the city let the bridge and the inside of the bridge deteriorate, which will possibly be a good segue into the next photograph, because in the book I talk about the fascination I had for years and years and years with the inside of the Brooklyn Bridge, because my windows faced out on the approach. I know we can talk about the different parts of the bridge later, but basically I lobbied the city for months and months and months when they were about to embark on a rehabilitation structure of part of the roadway. So after I was allowed entrance at my own risk, on my first journey into the superstructure inside, one of the workers took me down a ladder, which was probably about 50 feet in depth. I had to climb down, and left me alone in this subterranean chamber with broken floorboards and tunnels and mazes that, some of them were largely unexplored. So this was a pivotal part of my own personal journey, because I started to realize that this bridge had not only a story to it on the outside, but it was also on the inside. And what was so fascinating about being in this part of the bridge 50 feet under the street level was that the chambers, not only were, if you went from one place to another, were totally different than each other, but this one in particular was bricked by hand. There were no machines that would lower these bricks into place. So that they had to be done by stonemasons, years and years and years ago. So we can right now go on to the next one that I chose to put in this talk. Okay, and this one, by contrast, is 2 stories above the street level, and actually, it almost sort of looks out on my windows. Um, um, so it's one of those open windows that I can look at every single day of my life, and try and figure out what the hell was going on in there. Sorry. So this one was so fascinating because the ceiling of the arch was not bricks. It was this gorgeous wooden carved beams, and it almost reminded me of a keel of a boat. So this experience of going inside, which began as a photo essay for a magazine, um, led me to all these questions about the inside, like what were these warehouses for, who built them, how long ago were they used, all those kind of questions. So what I decided to do was go to Rutgers, to your collection library, to look for answers to how and why these spaces existed. And I knew when I got there, I don't believe I met you the first time. I can't, everything after a while gets all fuzzy. But what I do know is that because I knew that John Roebling, the German immigrant, was the designer of the bridge, I asked to see some of his archives, thinking, his notes, thinking maybe I could find some answers in there. So we can now go to the next image. Okay, so this this object became transformational for me for so many reasons, and I should first say that that first time that I was at the library, I certainly did not find what I was looking for. I found no answers about the mysterious abandoned warehouses inside of the bridge, but what I found was something much, much greater and much more grander, much more transformational for me. For some reason, and of course now all of this is on microfilm, and I don't believe, perhaps Fernanda can answer this later, I held Mr. Roebling's pocket sketchbook of his calculations of the Brooklyn Bridge, meaning like this man figured it out in his head and you know wrote it down, trying to figure out different aspects of how can I actually plan a bridge over the East River. So clearly, if you are handling in your hands, if you are holding in your hands something of that magnificence and importance, it changed me for so many reasons. And because as a photographer, I am interested in history and the historical record, a lot of my pictures of New York and writings about what I'm photographing. This was different. This was like something I was consumed with my whole life as an artist, is that what is brilliance? What is greatness? What is, for lack of a better word, genius? And I felt that this pocket notebook said something to me. It was much greater than anything. Maybe it was because I was able to hold it, but it was about, how do you do this? How does one person in a notebook create the Brooklyn Bridge? I mean, that was astounding to me. And because, and sometimes, the best accidents are, the accidents in life are what lead you to greater discoveries. Um, one road could lead to the other that's unplanned. So this particular experience took me on another trajectory, and that was, who are these people that built the Brooklyn Bridge? Who was Mr. John Roebling from Mühlhausen, Thuringia, Prussia? And what about his son? And knowing from our New York history that Mr. Roebling passed before he even got to work on the bridge, we knew that his son somehow finished it, or his wife was involved. But up until that point, I was not immersed in the story. I was more immersed in the endurance of the Brooklyn Bridge, that the whole urban landscape of Manhattan could change all around it, but the bridge didn't. So the challenge for me was always to find new ways to take pictures of it that were meaningful, perhaps. So this particular experience at Rutgers was truly a seminal experience for me personally, because it made me think about these things on a much deeper level than I ever had before, and I had never done before. So before, in whatever writings, I did what a traditional writer would do, is just go to primary source material in magazines and books, but never to someone's personal diaries and letters. I mean, so that really did start to change things for me. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so here is where I have to introduce the cast of characters in my beautiful story. And I put John Augustus Roebling together with his firstborn son, Washington, who's wearing his Civil War uniform, fighting for the Union Army. Mr. Roebling on the left, was photographed very sparsely. I mean, there are very few photographs of him that actually exist, and also for Washington as well, although he lived, in a different time. But for Mr. John Roebling, this picture, I believe, is anonymous. I couldn't find a name attached to it, and I love that in history. When you find these amazing pictures and no one knows who does it, it kind of like puts you in a place of great, you just become humble, because, in our contemporary life as an artist, everything is about me, and my work, and this, and meanwhile, sometimes you could find some of the greatest pieces of art, and you will never know who did them or how it happened or anything like that. So what I want people to know about Mr. John Roebling, who I personally had quite a relationship with for many reasons, was an immigrant born in 1806 in this walled ancient town of Mühlhausen, which is still there. It's on the map. If anyone wants to go and visit, it's an amazing place, because you feel like you're back in time, like 500 years. Mr. Roebling, and you can almost tell from that photograph with that icy stare that he was, in all probability, an incredibly intense man with a mercurial mind. He was known to be intransient, intractable, brilliant, never took a day off, was a workaholic and manic, always trying to resolve problems. And in terms of his professional life, he was not just one profession. He was an engineer, he was a surveyor, he was an urban planner, he was a philosopher, he was a structural engineer, he was an accountant, he was a musician, he was a philosopher. I don't know if I just said that. And he accomplished what he accomplished in one lifetime. Most people could never um, imagine that they could do even one or two things. And of course, the most important thing that I thank God didn't leave out is that he is best known in America for his building of suspension bridges and aqueducts, but also not the invention, but the manufacture of wire rope, which did change the face of American technology. So this is the man, this stoic immigrant who came to America, not to be an engineer initially, but because he was pulled by this utopian vision of freedom, which we will get into a little later. But for right now, I'm going to switch over to the right-hand side, to Washington. Washington Roebling was his firstborn son of many sons and daughters in the family. And the reason I feel so compelled to talk about him in particular is because in immigrant families, and I know this from my own experience, is that it's the oldest, usually the firstborn son, and I do believe I have a relative online who will relate to this, whose father was the firstborn in my immigrant family, who the father always puts the most responsibility and the most hope and the most faith and the most pressure. So from an early age, Washington was subject to his father's dominance and opinionated criticism of him. But what also ironically became true is that because the father wanted him to follow in his footsteps and become an engineer, that it turned out that kicking and screaming, Washington Roebling became brilliant at what he did. And because his training was more contemporary than his father's, turned the tide of designing the Brooklyn Bridge after his father's death by implementing new, breaking with his father's plans. You know, he introduced new ways of constructing parts of the bridge, which we'll possibly get into a little bit later. But the story between these two was nothing short of a Greek tragedy, because what we have as a result of being at Rutgers University is what we found out, that I believe it was in the early 70s, a collection of letters and diaries that were left there from some family members, where out of this collection of letters, we discovered that Washington Roebling had put into words what he wanted to write about his father. So unfolding over this talk, we will talk a little bit more about that. But in the end, we had a father and son dynamic, uh, which became a drama and a tragedy. So we can go on to the next principal creator. And here is Emily Roebling, and I chose these two pictures of her. One as a young woman when she met and fell in love with Washington Roebling, who was in the Union Army at the time, working as aide-de-camp to her brother, Gouverneur Kimball Warren. And on the right-hand side, we have Emily years after the Brooklyn Bridge is completed, where she is standing there very proudly in her cap and gown after receiving a law certificate from New York University. One of the things that struck me about both of these pictures was this intense stare that she had. In fact, all three of them had these intense stares of their eyes, which made me, which brought me in even further to the story, that there was a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a sense of steadiness in their gaze that really spoke to me. So Emily and Washington did fall in love, but were unable to really be together during the course of the Civil War. So what's remained was this flurry of letters that went back and forth from the battlefield. And it was a remarkable experience to read these letters and see the love and the desire, the physical desire that they had for each other, and all their dreams and hopes about finally, after the war being over, finally getting married and having this beautiful life together, and the plans they were making and the expectations. It was, for me, quite remarkable to experience those letters and those photographs. So, so we have these three people whose lives changed dramatically as the Brooklyn Bridge became a reality in all three of their lives. So we can go to the next picture. Okay, so what I'm going to do is show you a few pictures from each of the principal characters. So this is a photograph I made in Mühlhausen, and it depicts this one street that I walked, which is an example of some of the streets in Mühlhausen that look unchanged from medieval times. And one of the things that became apparent to me going to Mühlhausen, because I was so compelled by John Roebling's story that I felt it became part of my experience to understand him, was to go back to this one town and see if I could retrace his steps or get any clues at all as to who this man was, what created him, how his environment shaped his life, and questions concerning his background. So one of the things that became clear after visiting the archives there was how interested Germans are in their own genealogy, because I remember the time I spent at the archives with Roswitha Hennig. I remember people were coming in and just wanting to know more about their families and pulling these books from the shelves and asking questions. It was actually pretty fascinating. But in John Roebling's case, remarkably, the family history is very sparse, and we only have a few historians and people who were interested in the subject of his early bridge building and his early proposals in Germany that would offer some clues into who this person really was. But one of the most important things to know about John Roebling was his parents. And even though, again, the archives couldn't supply me with much, there were some basic facts: that his father was a tobacconist by trade, who apparently was very, not a stagnant human being, but just had a sufficient life, selling his tobacco, going to the beer hall at 5 o'clock every day, and just basically being boring and not very adventurous. While his mother, who I believe was 5 years older than him, must have been um, incredibly frustrated. She apparently was a housefrau and also managed some of the finances for the tobacco business. And according to what was known then, that she had a very volatile temper. But according to these facts, her experience with her children became more um, um, dominant, more interesting for her when her youngest son started to show promise and talent and an intellectual capacity that mirrored her own. So she kind of took him in stride and in a way, almost like a stage mother, wanted him to continue with some education that would not only get him beyond the walls of Mühlhausen, but to perhaps find a way so he could be a great success. So one of the pivotal things in his early years in Mühlhausen was his mother decided to send him after primary school to a Dr. Solomon Unger in Erfurt, who was a grand mathematician. And she sent him to this school where he got excellent education in mathematics and some of the Greek, some of the Greek philosophies of studying music, literature, and drawing. And from that, he used it as a springboard to get into Polytechnic, the Polytechnic Engineering School in Berlin, where his own interests began to blossom. He moved to the top of his class very quickly and became fascinated with bridge building and hydraulics. So at this point, it would seem like, this is a man who, as a young man, was moving on a trajectory, would do something great, interesting in Germany, or become something of an engineer or surveyor there. But what happened was something unpredictable. And that is, John Roebling was not too thrilled with being a surveyor and paving roads in Westphalia. And so we don't know, the historical record doesn't say whether or not he even got his degree in engineering. I mean, some people say he did, some people say he didn't. It doesn't matter. He went home at some point, and on one of these street corners, he met a guy named Etzler, who had just come back from the New World and was preaching to anyone that would listen to him that you will have a greater promise of freedom and democracy if you got away from Germany and you were able to go to America. And particularly, he was preaching about a place called Pennsylvania. So John Roebling and him connected once again, and because they both were, as many of the young people were at that time, very greatly influenced by Hegel, who was his professor, took some of his classes at the University of Berlin, and at that time he was a rock star. So all these young people wanted to flock to his lectures to hear him preach about the sanctity of the individual idea, that you must own your own ideas and not let anybody criticize you or change the way you think about everything. And of course, I'm distilling down the brilliance of Hegel into something that we can understand. Possibly one of the reasons that John Roebling decided to immigrate to America is because he had greater hopes and dreams for himself, and he knew that if he stayed in Germany, he would never be able to realize some of the projects that he had already proposed and that were turned down. And one of the things, and you could move to the next slide. Sorry, I spent too much time on this. So in Mühlhausen, this experience of being in that town and going to school there and having these interactions with Etzler brought him into believing more and more in Hegel's philosophy, and to try and take a giant leap of faith and actually try and get to the New World so he could find some way to set up some utopian settlement and find his way and harness the powers of nature and become his own free, independent man. So what we're looking at in this picture is a statue that the people in Mühlhausen, the townspeople in Mühlhausen, erected to him as he looks directly at the Divi Blasius Church where he was baptized. And this particular church is located right around the corner from where he was born, where he grew up. So you can only imagine that as a young child up until his young adulthood, that this town and the power of this environment was a profound influence on his psyche. Okay, we can go to the next. Okay, so in the next two slides, I want to show you some of the photographs I made. Like all great artists, you have the ability to use your projects as stepping stones. In other words, John Roebling just didn't create the design for the Brooklyn Bridge, but he started out as someone who explored in his smaller projects the possibilities of how to harness the power of transportation through his suspension bridge aqueducts. This one is part of the D&H Canal, which he got a contract for years and years before he built the Brooklyn Bridge. And you could see in this beautiful remnant the cutout where at one time the trough was that brought the canal boats from one side of the river to the other. Okay, we can go on to the next. And most famously in his resume of great accomplishments, we see on the Brooklyn Bridge a great example of his invention of the wire rope, his manufacture of the wire rope. And you could see the cable strung, the individual strands strung together to make one particular cable. I photographed this in the winter lights so you could actually see the strands on the cable as they are suspended gracefully from the tower. So we could go on to the next. Okay. So from Washington's story, I picked out two photographs that meant something to me while studying his life story. And because of his memoirs, we know that his childhood was quite brutal and quite traumatic. And, you know, you could read more about that in the book, but that at some point, the need to separate himself from his father became apparent. So when his father threw him out of the house and told him he had to enlist in the Civil War to fight against the Confederates, he did so. And it was only through this experience that he finally started to create his own identity independent of his father's. So one of the most dramatic experiences I had in learning about these three people was to actually go to Gettysburg. And I did it at a time when I knew there wouldn't be any tourists there. It was probably the coldest day in winter. And I climbed up on top of Little Round Top and tried to imagine through his memoirs what it would be like to fight off, I believe it was the Texans that were coming from the valley below. So once you get up there, the experience of the war and the experience of what this man had to accomplish in his life as a Union soldier really made me think about the sense of his own work ethic and the sense of his own responsibility to his job. Because every task that Washington was assigned to do in the Civil War, whether it be reconnoitering in balloons or manufacturing these makeshift pontoon bridges into enemy territory, he did with the utmost responsibility, care, and, if I may say, bravery. And for that, he became, after surviving several near death attacks of cannonballs during some heavy firing, he in the war zones, he was breveted a colonel and became known from that point on as Colonel Roebling, even to the men on his staff that built the Brooklyn Bridge. So we can go on to the next slide. And again, this is Little Round Top. And again, just like photographing the Brooklyn Bridge. Gettysburg is a very popular landmark in the States. So I wanted to express a little bit of that feeling of that special plateau where so many Confederate soldiers lost their lives, and Washington Roebling, among some other soldiers, turned the tide against the Confederates during that particular battle of Little Round Top. So we can go on to the next now. Okay, so with Emily, I chose to show people what I consider to be an incredible experience, and that was to learn about her obsession with cutting and pasting every article written about the Brooklyn Bridge in the 12 to 13 years time span it took to construct. So it becomes quite an awe-inspiring situation where you can look at these scrapbooks and see the trials, the tribulations, the tragedies, the triumphs of the daily experience of building the Brooklyn Bridge. And apparently, according to the factual record, she made these entries. She cut and pasted these magazine and newspaper clippings twice a day. So I thought this photograph in so many ways gave me a window into who this person may be. And that is, not only are all these myths that grew up around Emily, but basically as a wife to the chief engineer of the bridge who became incapacitated with caisson's disease, she really became the protector and the defender. And there are clues to this throughout this 13-year period that they built the bridge. So we can go on to the next. Yes, and this other piece that I decided to show was part of a brief that she wrote years after the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed and ended in 1883. And it gave me a clue as to how 13 long years of helping her husband and becoming almost a silent liaison between her and other members of the construction crew, the engineers, the politicians, the lobbyists, the entrepreneurs, how that could have affected her life as a woman in the Gilded Age that had no voice and of course, certainly not the right to be heard or to speak. So this is a part of her brief that she wrote about divorce. Then, as now, disputes of every kind arose between husband and wife, and if in a moment of passion the husband killed the wife, the law dealt with him as if he had killed one who was a stranger to him, and he was punished as he would been for killing any person. But if the wife killed the husband, no matter what the provocation, it was a much more atrocious deed. She not only transgressed the laws of humanity and conjugal affection, but by her wicked act threw aside all submission to her husband's authority and was guilty not of murder, but treason, just as if she had killed the king. So, okay. So we can go on to the next slide. This is an image that came from that contact sheet that I showed before. And what I wanted to say is that in the minds of so many people, the Brooklyn Bridge was this glorious event. It's to be celebrated all over the world. People seem to want to flock to it when they come to New York. It's one of the first things on the list to go visit, to walk over. But what they don't know, what they don't understand is that this bridge became a ghostly specter to all three of the Roeblings, because each of them suffered in their own personal way as a result of the need to get this bridge built. And so, because before I talked about John and his intractableness, his sense of of determination, of his manic work activity, his need to conquer every possible idea, to be a manufacturer, an entrepreneur, an inventor, a philosopher, a bridge builder, a musician, on and on and on. What they didn't know is that his own intransience and his inability to accept other people's opinions is what did him in, because after suffering this accident on the pier, right even before the bridge had begun work, he suffered an accident which created um, the possibility that his toes had to be amputated because a ferry ran into them while he was totally immersed in his surveying. So because he went to a doctor, they brought him to a doctor and they amputated his toes without any anesthetic. He was brought back to Washington's house, and there and then he decided to build his own contraption. And from that point on, the water cure became his only way to cure himself. And he died of lockjaw because the water cure didn't work. His toes got infected. And 10 days later, after experiencing a hideous death, Washington was tapped to take over as chief engineer at the age of 31. And right at the time that Emily and Washington were just about to start their marriage, all of a sudden they were immersed in the project of of building the largest suspension bridge in the history of the world that was never tested, never tried. There was no solid plan in place. And then at some point very early on, Washington Roebling himself became a victim of a horrible illness at the time unknown. It was called Caisson's disease. So, which occurred when men were working under the water, and he, of course, was supervising the underwater foundations of the bridge. So his incapacitation led to Emily's need to keep the bridge in Roebling's name. But during that 11-year period, there was very little um, understanding or record of what she must have gone through to make this bridge happen. But we do know that she became someone that he relied on every day to communicate to the outside world what his plans were and what his specifications were every day for the superstructure. But clearly there was a depression there and a sense that perhaps his overbearing father was still the ghostly specter in his life. But in the end, what became clear for me was to try and identify those personality and character traits that brought this bridge into completion. And I can't help but thinking that in each three of them, the sense of drive and stamina and need to keep the bridge in the Roebling name became mainstay to their priorities. And in the case of John Roebling, his manic work activity was the true sign of his strengths. In the case of his son Washington, it was his sense of responsibility and duty to get the job done right. And for Emily, it was her sense that she could not let this project fail. She could not let the project escape the Roebling name, and she could not let her husband, after everything he had been through in his life, lose that opportunity. So my feeling about this picture is much more than just the spiritual understanding of the bridge. It really has to do with summing up the lives of these three people. And we can go to the next slide. And this one is a fanciful, I call it the mysterious piano that appeared at the waterfront of the Brooklyn Bridge. But here I want to say a few words about the historical record and how this relates to today. Because one thing that I've discovered in this journey to try and understand the Roeblings was the fact that because it's a very, very concentrated lifetime of facts to consume, we know that over time the story has become distorted. The factual record itself has become distorted. There's a lot of myths that have sprung up about who built the Brooklyn Bridge, who it was, how the bridge got built, and most importantly, when I take these walks over the bridge, you can see people standing around a tour guide, and the tour guide not, really effectively giving the factual information. It becomes distorted. So I thought, thinking about the bridge, I really started to think about the world we inhabit today and how easy it is to not follow the facts and to, misconstrue basic premises. So for example, in terms of the Brooklyn Bridge, lots of times the father gets confused with the son, or lots of times the way Emily and Washington are portrayed is that he could neither speak, hear, walk, or do anything, and that the way he communicated to her was by tapping on her arm, and that they had created this sound communication by how many taps he would make on her arm, and then she would be dispatched to the bridge to give these specifications and orders through the tapping of the arm. I mean, and all you have to do is go online to see these sort of simplified facts and complete distortions of the truth. So it's very frustrating, because I feel that we're losing in our culture the ability to read and go to primary source material for our information, but rather we rely on secondhand or third hand or fourth hand, and that's where we get into trouble. And this was for me a very disturbing part of doing the story, and also very revelatory. And so right now I'd like, because this is a enormous amount of information to condense into 25 minutes, I'd like to turn it over to a Q&A, because I think I'm probably more prepared to go into certain details. Yes.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was great. I'm just going to look at the chat. So somebody has a question about the piano.
Oh,
I knew they would.
okay. What do they want to know about the piano?
What is the piano doing on the beach?
Well, I didn't know, but I did find out later on through one of my neighbors that it was a performance art piece that was done, and they videotaped it. But ironically, and I never met these people, but ironically, they left the piano on the beach. So, I mean, I had to have that picture in my book because it was so wonderful. But that is your answer. A performance artist came, made a video, and left the piano. I'm not sure, I don't know if it was a Steinway, but over time the piano got stripped like everything else on the New York Boy. You can't leave things out very long, or else things get, dismembered. So and I'm hoping that people, because the talk is so impossible to get into some of the amazing details in the lives of the principal creators, there's so much that I glossed over in this talk that I would want to go on for hours and hours, especially my own feelings about John.
So we have a question. Were you influenced at all by David McCullough's History of the Brooklyn Bridge?
Yes, of course. I mean, everyone has to read that book. But what became very clear to me, I mean, he is a great writer and he did a thorough job. But my work is not about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. That was done. It is not about me. If you buy my book and you read it, you see that the challenge for me was not to repeat the same history that all these other people. It's about the experience of understanding of how these great things get done. And in my talk here for now, all I want people to take away with is that you have this immigrant who is a rags to riches story, who left his native uh, Prussia, not because of poverty in so much as because he was an idea guy. And if I had time to show you some of the amazing early drawings, particularly his proposals for a suspension bridge over the English Channel, or all these incredible, some of them I have in the book, some I did, that he couldn't pull that off in Germany at that period in history. And again, without getting into detail about the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 and the plundering of Napoleon and all of these wonderful, amazing facts that I learned about German history and what it must have been like for young people then who were living during a time of revolution in Europe, where people wanted to throw off the monarchies and the autocracy and believe in ideas and get away from organized religion, that this must have been a conflict for him that must have been unbearable as a young creative person. And it's impossible in a lecture, albeit the archives are central to this experience that I had. But the idea that he could leave his home at great risk. Him and Etzler had to go underground to print these pamphlets and, to believe in this Hegelian utopian ideal of freedom and harnessing natural resources. And I'm leaving, I want to, and ironically, when Roebling started his first colony in Saxonburg in Pennsylvania, and of course he chose to go there because he didn't want to go into the slave states. He was an abolition. He was totally against slavery, but basically he didn't go there right away to become an engineer, but he was armed with this education, and it was always in the back of his mind. And what was so fascinating about going to Saxonburg was to see, and I don't know if anyone from Saxonburg's on this lecture or not, but the history of his experiences, his struggles as an artist, as a creative person, to get to see as a surveyor this Portage Railroad and the hemp ropes break and they kill these people, and to have this avid reader and this, he packed these magazines from this miner in the Hartz Mountains who talked about wire rope, and he never forgot it. And so when he got to Saxonburg, even though he was farming and he wasn't even interested, he didn't know how to do it. And he used to scream at potatoes and beat his mules in the backyard. God knows what went on, beat his family. I mean, these memoirs that Washington wrote were unbelievable. And you have them. They're priceless. They're absolutely priceless. Um, that the idea that this man could change the face of American technology by setting up this rope walk, and his little child, Washington, running barefoot, bringing whiskey and bread to the workers who had nothing but a belief in John Roebling's dream. We can do this. We're going to find a way to substitute the hemp rope for the wire rope, and we're going to get that Portage Railroad over the mountain, through the canals, get that coal back to New York City. That was a struggle for someone who had nothing but his own ideas to hold on to. And that's what becomes, as an artist, so captivating for me, was his belief in his ideas, no matter what anybody said. What are you, nuts? What are you you're going to make wire rope, and I don't want that. That's going to hurt my business. You know, God knows what he went through. But on the other hand, he is his mother's son. And you take with you your family, your genetics, all that stuff, which I tried to figure out about genius, because on top of doing this work, my whole fascination in life is getting great things done. I mean, because we are surrounded in a sea of mediocrity to the point where I lose it sometimes. I just can't deal with it anymore. So when you're holding Mr. Roebling's pocket diary with the friggin' Brooklyn Bridge, scribbled out. Oh yeah, let's see how we build this. You know, how do you go from what do you do? And then Washington, this tortured child who became more courageous than his father, was going down into these caissons that he had to design and build and find new ways to get these men up the air chutes, and he's down there just like his father, maybe trying to prove he worked longer and harder. I mean, who God knows what went on in that family. But all I am telling you is that Brooklyn Bridge was a specter in their lives. It was damnation, because it took the best years of, well, John never got to see his masterpiece. He did himself in by saying, well, my water cure is going to save me. Get rid of all these goddamn doctors. I know best, right? And 10 days later, he was friggin' dead. And his son had to prove his worth to his father. And on top of that, he got sick and wound up in the same bed as his father. And lo and behold, Emily had to look at the great love of her life laying there in half blind, half depressed. God knows if the man suffered from depression. It was not clinically diagnosed at that time. And she said, this is my lot in life. I have to deal with this. And who knows how 11 years of trying to build that bridge, to shepherd that bridge to completion, and dealing with all these nasty men. Men, and more men. How in God's name she was able to navigate those, most likely some sexual predator. I mean, who knows what she went through? Because in your archive, we have discovered that there, just like Rosemary Woods' Nixon tapes, there's a whole blank of correspondence that doesn't talk at all, or very minimally about her emotional state and what she was really feeling. And she was a mother. She had one son that she gave birth to in Mühlhausen. That's part of the story I couldn't get into, how the father sent them on their great honeymoon to study underwater pneumatic caissons. I'm sure she loved that. And she had a premature delivery in Mühlhausen. And one of the pictures in my book is to show that little baptismal, which was so beautiful. But anyway, getting back to it. So Emily, not only did she have to protect and defend her husband, but she came out of that experience a changed woman. And so much of her own story and her perceptions have been lost to history because that record doesn't exist. And I think it was you who mentioned that perhaps Washington burned some of her notes and diaries. We don't know. So all we could do is suppose. It's like open for interpretation. But all I could tell you is the reason that I put that brief in is because that is such a clue as to where she was in the aftermath of building the Brooklyn Bridge.
If I could just interrupt, I know
No, interrupt.
it's getting late, but
Oh, all right. Sorry.
we have a couple more questions.
All right.
David Robbins is asking, where does the Roebling Cincinnati Bridge fit into the preparation for the Brooklyn Bridge?
Oh, well, it was, as I said in the book, I don't know if you remember Mini-Me from what's his name, the comedian, what's his name, the guy who used to be on Saturday Night Live. what's his name? Anyway, it's the mini-me. It's the prototype that John Roebling designed for the Brooklyn Bridge vis-a-vis. And again, I am not an engineer, and I will never suppose to give you facts about things that I don't know. But what's fascinating about that Ohio Bridge, which they later changed to the John Roebling Bridge, even though his son finished it. Again, another disparaging fact to know about the whole story was that when Mr. Roebling designed the East River Bridge, he didn't put that Romanesque barrel vault in there. He put the points on. And that is fascinating to me because, again, if you go back and I couldn't do this even in my book, but I was staying in a place that was right across from the Divi Blasius church. So every morning I'd get up, have a cup of coffee, and look at the actual structure, the front of the Divi Blasius, and it's the same thing as the Brooklyn Bridge. It's the same design, the same architectural abutments. So yes, the Cincinnati Bridge was the prototype in specifications, but the change that Roebling made in his design was put the points on the Gothic to create that Gothic image for the public.
Thanks. So somebody, Jan is saying, Barbara, your photos are incredible,
Oh,
but so is the quality of the prints. Do you do all your own printing? And are you still using film or have you switched to digital?
oh my God, do I have to answer that? All right.
I think I could answer it.
Well, yes, I'm a film girl. I will always be. And I do, in fact, right now, I'm printing some new portfolios with my wonderful, brilliant artist friend, Claire Gilliam, who also worked with me at the ICP. But the book itself was printed in Italy, in Loreto, by the Pagini Group. And I actually went there to supervise the printing of the book. At the same time, they were doing a book about Michelangelo that was commissioned by the Pope. So it's not only about printing your own work, but if you're making a book, you have to really think about the quality of the printing as it goes to press. So, and yes, I do work in digital now. Yes.
Thanks. And somebody is asking, what instrument did John Roebling play?
The flute, I believe. Okay, I'm pretty sure it was the flute. The flute, the piano, one of those two. You know, sometimes I have so much information in my head, and so it's either the flute or the piano. But then he had an accident in his wire rope mill in Trenton, and he couldn't play. He couldn't play his instrument anymore. I remember that. But whoever asked that question, if they send me my the email, I'll get back to them on that because I don't like to say it was either the flute or the piano.
I'm not sure either. And then, so Tracy Wood is writing a novel about Emily Roebling. So she asks, how do you feel about historical fiction when we try to imagine the parts of a story we don't know?
That's a good one. Well, I don't know. I don't know how I can answer that because I guess you have to be a damn good writer to create a story that let me put it to you this way. All right. Whoever asked that question. There's also another woman who wrote The Silent Builder, who also tried to do a portrait of Emily. But I think, in my opinion, that the best story ever is just the facts themselves. This story is so completely amazing that I don't think you have to make anything up. Like, I just think the three characters, I think their roles, their psychological states, what each of them brought to the Brooklyn Bridge, the experiences they personally had in their backstories, Washington's childhood, his experience as a young adult at Rensselaer, heading off to war to fight the Confederates, Emily's being shepherded by her oldest brother, Gouverneur Warren, after the father died, to believe in her intelligence and sent her to school, which was unheard. Very, very, very few girls would get to go to school back in the 1800s and graduate in science and botany. And so I don't know. I can't really answer that because that's not my thing. I just think that in this particular case, the facts themselves are so compelling, the stories so compelling. Putting these little puzzles together is so fascinating that, I personally, I have, for me, I just can't imagine doing that kind of thing.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, well, I hope I didn't upset that whoever asked the question, but I didn't mean to.
No, she says, thank you for your honest answer.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you can't make a great book. I'm just saying I'm not that kind of I'm a visual artist, I'm basically, and I love to write, but
So we don't seem to have any more questions, and it's almost 6:30. So
Oh,
I wanted to thank you, Barbara, for your this fascinating talk. And I have to tell everybody that when Barbara first came,
I love you.
the collection is very, fragile.
Yeah.
And so she had to use, we asked researchers to use microfilm.
Right.
And, when I knew that Barbara was an artist from New York, and, she was inspired by the Brooklyn Bridge, I was like, she's not going to last an hour with that microfilm. And, but she, of course, ended up coming in for days and days and hours and weeks.
And then years later.
And years later to do this research. So I wanted to thank you for your patience and for helping us tell the story of the bridge. And thanks again, and thanks for giving this lecture.
Oh, Fernanda, you're the best, and hopefully we will be working together again on some projects.
And thank you everyone for coming and for staying at this late hour.
I see Robert is on the screen. Wo ist Robert? Wo ist du? Robert. He's not up on the screen. Anyway, well, thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward, if you have any further questions or anything, just contact me. I'm easy to find. So.
And remember, how to get the signed copy of the book is in the chat.
Yes, because we wanted to go to paper.
Fernanda.
Yeah.
Fernanda, if people joined after, because I don't see it in the chat anymore. If you could put that information.
Oh, I'll put it in again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Right. So should I log off now or what?
Well, let me just again.
I'm just going to put this.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you for putting up with my rants.
We were delighted by
you have a great library and great people, and it just was an amazing experience to work with you.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Okay, bye everybody. Bye.
Barbara, great to see you again. Bye.
Oh, hello, my student is David. I have your book over here. It's on the bookshelf. So anyone else want to say hi or goodbye before I log off? Great, David, you're great. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
Just a reminder that Fernanda will be putting this recording up, the audio and the video up on our YouTube channel.
Oh,
There's
great.
a question about that. So people, if you missed part of it, want to relive it, it'll be there for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sonia.
What is the YouTube channel?
If you can find it at the Rutgers Library's main page.
Okay, thank you.
We could also send a list out. We could send it out into the registrant list if people are interested.
Great, that would help.
Thank you, Barbara.
Oh, Janie, so great to see you. Soon we'll be hopefully we'll be out of this nightmare, and we could
Hope
actually
to see
see
you
each other again, but thanks for listening to my rants again.
Oh, my colleague just put the YouTube address in.
Okay. thanks.
Also, Barbara, and that's your website so that people can find
Okay. All right, Claire. Without Claire, I don't know what I would do.
Yeah, thank you, Claire.
Seeing you again, and everybody else, and my cousin Bobby. Thank you. And okay, so should I log off now?
Yeah, I think I'm going to end the meeting.
All right.
So bye, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Okay.